It is the 1st of November, 1806. In the dead of night, a lone rider gallops through the darkness, his breath visible in the cold autumn air. His destination, the headquarters of a small Swedish detachment stationed in the Duchy of Lauenburg, on the border with Hanover. The message he carries is urgent. The French army, led by Napoleon himself, is advancing at an alarming pace after crushing the Prussian forces at the twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt. The rider brings orders directly from the king, Gustav IV Adolf, addressed to the Swedish commander, Colonel von Morian. The message reads, "Considering the rapid advance of the French armies, it is possible that the detached corps could be cut off from all communication with the rest of the army and Swedish Pomerania. To avoid encirclement, a retreat should be sought to one of the coastal cities, such as Rostock, Lübeck or Wismar, and even Hamburg, if no other option remain. There, the troops should embark on transport ships, which should be seized by force if necessary, and depart for Stralsund as quickly as possible." Von Morian is now faced with a grim reality. Jena and Auerstedt had taken place nearly 2 weeks ago, and with the Prussian army in ruins, the French have already reached Stettin. His force, some 1,500 men, is dangerously scattered, with detachments spread across a vast area, some as far as 130 kilometers apart. The land corridor to Swedish Pomerania is closing fast. His dilemma is clear. How can he regroup his men and escape before the French cut off all routes to the coast? But before we delve into von Morian's decision, we must first understand why Swedish troops found themselves stationed so far from their own territory in the first place. To do that, we must go back a year, to the start of the War of the Third Coalition. While the main front of the war was in Central Europe, where Austria and Russia led the fight against Napoleon, Sweden's entry into the coalition presented an opportunity for an attack from the north. The idea was to strike through Hanover, towards the Batavian Republic, forcing Napoleon to divert forces away from his main campaign. The plan, largely orchestrated and financed by Britain, called for a 20,000-strong Russian army to sail to Swedish Pomerania and join forces with 10,000 Swedish troops. Together, they would march into Hanover, while a British force landed in Cuxhaven to support the offensive. If successful, this maneuver would not only turn Hanover to Britain, but also open a new front against France, while Napoleon was occupied further east. On paper, it was a promising strategy. In reality, it quickly unraveled. The Prussians, wary of any large troop movements in northern Germany, refused to allow Allied forces to cross their territory. Relations between the Prussians and the Swedish kings were already strained, further complicating negotiations. The Russian troops arrived on schedule in early October 1805, but the Swedish forces were far from ready. It took until November for all Swedish units to assemble in Stralsund. By then, Napoleon had already achieved a stunning victory in the Ulm campaign and was on the verge of capturing Vienna. Unable to wait, the Russians marched ahead and joined the British forces, leaving the Swedish contingent behind. King Gustav IV Adolf, deeply distrustful of Prussia, feared a secret deal between the Prussians and the French that would see Hanover handed over without a fight. He hesitated, considering withdrawing from the campaign altogether. Eventually, he was persuaded to proceed, but by then any chance of effective coordination was lost. Despite the fact that Marshal Bernadotte had moved most French forces south to reinforce Napoleon, the Allies failed to make any significant gains in Hanover. Then, in December, Napoleon shattered the Austrian and Russian armies at Austerlitz. With that decisive victory, the coalition collapsed. The Russians were forced to retreat to Poland, and without their support, the British withdrew as well. The northern campaign was effectively over before it had truly begun. As the main Swedish force retreated back to Pomerania, a small detachment was left behind in Lauenburg. Originally meant to secure supply lines and maintain a presence in the region, their position became increasingly tenuous as the strategic situation deteriorated. When the Prussians signed the Treaty of Schönbrunn with France, it gave them the right to occupy Hanover. They now demanded that all Swedish troops be withdrawn to Swedish Pomerania. This was something Gustav Adolf would not tolerate, and the situation escalated into a minor skirmish where a much larger Prussian force outmaneuvered a small Swedish cavalry detachment. But the Swedish presence in Lauenburg would not be gone for long. With the constitution of the Fourth Coalition in the summer of 1806, Prussia agreed to a Swedish occupation of the Duchy of Saxe-Lauenburg. And that is why, in November of 1806, the 1,500-man-strong Swedish detachment in the duchy found themselves dangerously exposed, and Colonel von Morian had likely only hours to decide their fate. The decision Colonel von Morian made was to gather all his scattered units as quickly as possible in the small town of Ratzeburg, the capital of the duchy, situated on an island surrounded by 4 lakes. It was an excellent defensive position if the goal was to stand and fight. But that was not his mission. His orders were clear: retreat to Swedish Pomerania. Von Morian's decision has been heavily criticized by military historians. By choosing Ratzeburg, he placed himself in a strong defensive location, but one with poor roads, limited supplies, and no easy escape. 19th century military historian Johan Gustav Björlin had this to say: "What they were doing here would be entirely inexplicable if one did not know von Morian's admiration for Ratzeburg as a defensive position. Otherwise, such a place, with so few and difficult connections, should have been the very last to be chosen, unless one wished to be trapped there, as it was specifically designed for that purpose." Still, von Morian's quick action meant that by the very next day, November 2nd, his entire force, about 1,500 men, had assembled in Ratzeburg. His troops included a mounted battery of 6 cannons, 4 squadrons of the Småland Dragoon Regiment, and 2 battalions from 2 divisions of the Life Grenadier Regiment. Von Morian then received bad news. There weren't enough ships available in Wismar, his first choice for embarkation. Wismar had been a Swedish territory until just 3 years earlier, when it was sold to the Grand Duchy of Mecklenburg-Schwerin. With that option off the table, von Morian made a new decision, marching his entire force toward Lübeck in the hope of finding transport there. But despite having cavalry at his disposal, he failed to send an advance guard to scout ahead. Björlin harshly criticized this lack of foresight. With his numerous cavalry, this should have been quite easy for him. But instead, he marched with his entire force in one column, attempting through peculiar blind marches and detours to mislead an enemy whose location he did not know at all, and whose direction of march and intention he knew just as little. When the Swedes reached Lübeck, they encountered yet another problem. The city authorities refused them entry. Lübeck was a neutral city and would not grant passage to any military force, Swedish or otherwise. Von Morian, however, had direct orders. If stopped, he was to use force. According to Björlin, here's what happened next. On November 3rd, at midday, von Morian and his troops stood before the gates of Lübeck. These were closed, so Major Baron von Höpken was sent to the Senate with a request for free passage. The answer was no. Lübeck was neutral, and no foreign troops were allowed entry. Von Morian then requested permission to pass through to Travemünde and embark there. Again, he was denied. With his orders clear, he now commanded carpenters to cut down the gate. With that, the Swedes marched into Lübeck with flags flying, drums beating, and matchcords burning. Crowds gathered on the ramparts to witness the spectacle, but time was slipping away. Every hour lost made the escape more difficult. Inside Lübeck, von Morian struggled to find enough ships for the entire force. To solve this, he sent a cavalry detachment to Travemünde to secure additional transport. But once again, they met resistance. The gate captain refused to lower the drawbridge. The Swedes responded by climbing around the defenses, cutting the levers holding the gate in place and marching in, while the local guards retreated to a nearby bastion. In Travemünde, enough boats were found to evacuate the entire force. Despite this, von Morian hesitated. Rather than immediately ordering his troops to Travemünde, he insisted on securing as many ships as possible in Lübeck first. His later justification: he was following the king's orders literally, since those orders mentioned Lübeck, Wismar and Rostock as embarkation points, but not Travemünde. He felt bound to the letter of the command. Björlin, however, saw it differently. If a guess is permitted, von Morian is likely to have thought more throughout the entire time about the possibility of avoiding accountability and winning the king's favor than about wisely seeking to save his troops. The delays proved costly. It wasn't until November 5th that the boats in Lübeck finally set off down the river toward Travemünde. But stormy weather and strong winds made the journey agonizingly slow. And then disaster struck. That same afternoon, Prussian General Gebhard von Blücher, who had once served in the Swedish army, arrived in Lübeck with the remnants of his 30,000-strong force. Blücher's men quickly took up defensive positions along the northern bank of the river, preparing for battle against the pursuing French. Von Morian met with Blücher, explaining that the Swedes wished to remain neutral and only wanted to embark. But the Prussians hesitated to let them pass. The Swedish boats became stuck on the river overnight. By morning, the battle began. Now, von Morian's force found itself in the worst possible position, trapped on boats in the middle of a river, caught between two warring armies. The hired boatmen panicked and abandoned ship, leaving Swedish officers to take the helm. In an attempt to avoid French suspicion, they changed into civilian clothes. It was all for nothing. With the storm still raging and their lack of sailing experience, one boat after another ran aground. The Swedes, led by Colonel Möller, had been ordered by von Morian not to carry loaded weapons. Worse still, von Morian himself had already gone ahead to Travemünde, leaving his men stranded. Möller now saw the situation as hopeless. His troops were outnumbered 10-1, unprepared for battle, and caught between two overwhelming forces. There was only one option left. 7 companies of light grenadiers and 2 squadrons of the Småland Dragoon Regiment, 1,050 men in total, surrendered to the French under Marshal Bernadotte. And that is the story of how Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte first encountered the Swedish army he would one day rule as king. His fair treatment of Möller and the captured Swedes would later prove crucial in the movement that ultimately led to him taking the Swedish throne. As for von Morian, he was widely criticized for his poor planning. Björlin argued that he should have ordered his men to march to Travemünde instead of weighing down the boats with soldiers. Had he done so, the Swedes might have escaped capture altogether. But history is full of what-ifs, and in the end, von Morian's indecision ensured that his men would not return home as soldiers, but as prisoners of war.